We're going to look at a creature that lived on the coast of Georgia about 75 to 82 million years ago, a gigantic crocodilian called Deinosuchus. And I'm going to argue here that Deinosuchus in the eastern United States, at least, maybe in the western part too, was the top predator along the coast of what was then a bunch of different kinds of oceans from what we have now, and we'll see this in a couple of seconds. I'm going to use the term crocodilian rather than crocodile or alligator. Deinosuchus was distantly related to alligators, so it wasn't really an alligator, but it was closer to alligator than to the modern crocodiles. For a point of technical interest, crocodile itself, the genus Crocodilus, appeared in the Miocene epoch about 25 million years ago. So crocodiles as a genus don't go back very far in geological history. The crocodilian kind of creature goes back about 100 million years, and something vaguely like a crocodile goes back almost 200 million years. So it's kind of funny. It's an ancient lineage, but crocodiles per se are not really ancient. So we're going to call them crocodilians, just to be a little more technical here. Well, if we look at North America, going back to this time we're talking about, it's a very different place from today. First of all, there was an ocean bisecting the continent. We call it the Western Interior Seaway, dividing North America into two different subunits. One we call Appalachia, kind of logical name. The other one is called Laramida because of the Laramide Mountains of the time. There may have, whether there was a seaway up here is a little bit conjectural, but it doesn't affect our story. And as you'll see, Deinosuchus was found on both sides of the seaway. The ones we're going to talk about here are on the eastern side, and if we kind of blow up this area, you'll notice that the sea comes right up to about where we are here. West Georgia, East Alabama were the southernmost point of Appalachia at the time, and as we're going to see, Deinosuchus inhabited Appalachia all the way, as we know for sure, from Mississippi around the coast all the way up to New Jersey. We're going to focus on this part of the continent, but it turns out we had a species of Deinosuchus in Appalachia that is very distinct from the western side, and also, as I'm going to show you, may have been the top predator along the east coast at least. Now when we go look at a reconstruction of the environment of West Georgia about 75 million years ago, this is about what we see as our coastal environment. This is a salt marsh today. We had birds at the time, although, they weren't the same kind of birds we have now, but we had birds. And if you take an example of a present-day salt marsh, all nice and tranquil, but if you look kind of closely at various times, little violence enters with a crocodilian. In Georgia, the living crocodilian, of course, is going to be Alligator mississippiensis. And we show you here one crunching a turtle, and I'll point out that in its own way, Deinosuchus was also crunching turtles. Now, in fairness, alligators don't inhabit salt marshes very much, if at all, because they really can't get rid of salt. Fun fact, crocodiles actually have a salt excreting gland, so it allows them to live in the ocean for a while. Alligators don't, so they can't take in too much salt. So I'm kind of fudging a little bit here because the alligator would be a freshwater scene, whereas the salt marsh would be a coastal situation. But I couldn't come up with a Deinosuchus to demonstrate because they've been extinct for about 75 million years. The first idea that there was a giant crocodilian occupying North America came from research published in 1954 and an expedition to West Texas where they found just a few pieces from a really huge animal. Turns out there had been a previous discovery of it back in the early 1909, I have to go back to my notes, but they were just bones, they were just backbones, there weren't any skull material. They weren't quite sure what they were dealing with. They knew there were crocodilian type bones, but they really didn't do very much with it. But they found pieces of the skull in Big Bend Park in West Texas, and the American Museum of Natural History reconstructed the animal. This is from the bulletin itself, which is kind of like an interesting thing. they reconstructed the animals to look kind of like, like this. The reason I flashed that last picture was to show you where it came from. The specimen came from Big Bend Park, which at the time would have been right about there. And no, I'm wrong. Sorry, my bad. Right about there. Get a little geography here. That's called Big Bend, Texas. It's a national park, and I've actually been there to do research in Deinosuchus. It's quite a place. But right, what would have been the coast of Texas at this time is where the first Deinosuchus fossils were found. When they put them together, they reconstructed the skull to look like this. What's interesting is, I'll show you in the next picture, only a few pieces of this were actually bone. Most of this is artist's work, and as I'll show you, it was interesting for the time, but a lot of errors in this original reconstruction. The teeth were all wrong. The skull is way too tapering. The jaws don't taper to a point like they do in a modern crocodile. It's more of an alligator-like snout. And as you'll see, one of the things that's really interesting about this is just how big this thing was. Here's a photograph of one of the people working on it, and the dark stuff is what was actually found. The premaxillary or frontal bones here, a bit of the jaw, this is called retroarticular process, and a few teeth were about all that were found of the skull, plus a few vertebrae. But the size is correct. Even though the shape of it isn't exactly right, the size was about right. This skull would be about 1.8 meters long, pushing 6 feet. Now, when I was a little boy, I lived not too far from the museum. I used to visit it frequently, and that skull was bigger than I was up till I was about 9. It was a huge specimen. I always wanted to crawl inside the jaws and see what it would be like, but it was behind a glass case. Over the years, Deinosuchus has been a kind of a source of fascination. I think there's a Godzilla versus Deinosuchus video, and probably King Kong versus Deinosuchus. It's always been sort of the epitome of the giant predator in people's mind. This is a reconstruction for a BBC program. They sent me this photograph to approve of it, and I thought, well, the size is good. The back of the skull is okay, but the front, no. The snout's very different. Also, the teeth, these teeth back here were more blunt. The teeth through here are more like these teeth, kind of fatter, but not as pointy. This looks too much like a crocodile, and Deinosuchus was not a crocodile. It was in the family, but not a crocodile. Well, since the expedition in the 1940s that produced that specimen at the American Museum, they have found some complete skulls of Deinosuchus in Texas. Sorry about the fuzziness in this picture. I took it a couple of years ago when I was visiting, and I don't know why it didn't come out very good. But this is probably the most complete skull we have, and it's pretty big. It's not the biggest, but it's about 1.2 meters long, translating about 40-some inches long. Reconstructed, kind of smoothing it out, putting it upside down, look like this. And as you can see, unlike that first reconstruction of Deinosuchus, it's got a long, fairly parallel-sided skull, a very long row of teeth. And go back to that previous picture, you can compare at least the tooth row of this compared to that original reconstruction. As you can see from this, they had a much fewer row of teeth, and the teeth were a lot bigger back here in the reconstruction than the actual specimen. This image was actually just published this past year in a paper talking about reconstructing a lot about Deinosuchus, including a formal naming of 2 species, actually 3 they named, but I'm only going to recognize 2 of them personally, and we'll get to in a second. This is a current reconstruction of Deinosuchus from the western United States. The species is called Dinosuchus Rio Grandensis because it came from along the river in Big Bend Park. This was done at the University of Texas Memorial Museum. It was basically started by my colleague Juan Langston Jr., who was also my mentor on this. He had actually been part of the original discovery of Deinosuchus in West Texas. He was an elderly colleague and charming guy, a really interesting guy. But he supervised this, and one of the points that's really interesting is this huge inflated snout. we call it a rostrum. It's based on well, it's basically the anterior rostrum. This is the two premaxillary bones, which is basically the kind of the snagging overhang on the animal. The skull itself is about 1.6 to 7 meters long. Here's a view looking down the center of it. And the meter stick, you can't quite see how long it is, but it hangs away behind this meter stick here. What's really interesting about the skull is this huge nasal opening. Apparently the nostrils are not divided, at least in the bones. Plus there were these two holes in the premaxillae. And what's interesting is these are not the nostrils, these are just some holes in the bone. We don't know what they were for. That's always been one of the mysteries. But they're present, as far as we can tell, in every specimen of Deinosuchus has been found where you have these bones preserved, including one that I worked on from Alabama. So, for some reason, this thing needed to have a perforated frontal bone. It had a huge nostril. And what's interesting is how much this anterior part would stick out of the water when they were lurking just below the surface, which is probably the reason why there's this big inflated area. In other words, they could lurk underwater and still breathe. Now, Deinosuchus specimens have been found from all parts of the United States where there was a sea coast, reasonably, well, I should say most parts of the United States. We had specimens in Montana, specimens in Texas. This map doesn't show it, but we also have specimens in New Mexico and Wyoming. We don't know how far north they went, but a colleague of mine, Hector Rivera, in Mexico has specimens that would be about there. So we know they range from at least Coahuila province in Mexico up through western Montana in the west. In the east, we have specimens that go from Mississippi across Alabama. Now they're not shown on this map. This is from a recent paper. But if we go down to here, we've got quite a few specimens right around our region, which are the ones I've worked on mostly. And we have specimens in South Carolina, not shown on this map, North Carolina, all the way up to New Jersey. So looking over here, Deinosuchus in the east range from New Jersey down through the Carolinas, in West Georgia, across Alabama, up to Mississippi. Whether there are any in East Georgia, we haven't found any, but there aren't any rocks from the correct age preserving that. Now, this is kind of embarrassing, but my colleagues in a recent paper divided Deinosuchus into 3 species. The western one is Rio Grandensis, and they separate the one from Montana into a separate species. I personally don't accept that, but I haven't worked on it that much. And they named the eastern species after me, and I told them let that be. But I agree with them that the eastern species and the maybe 1 or 2 western species were different. And we'll get to that as we go along. Now, where it occurred, especially in Georgia and East Alabama, Deinosuchus is pretty common. This is only one of several drawers full of material. Mostly the teeth are in here. There are also a couple of skulls from this region, and a jaw, which we'll come to in a bit. Deinosuchus is a fairly common fossil. I haven't counted the total number, but I've probably, in the collections, my region, there are probably 200 or 300 teeth that we have found, probably a couple of dozen vertebrae, just, drawers full of material. Just lots of, very, very few bones together. Most of them are separated because of the conditions in the environment we collect from, but lots and lots of Deinosuchus signs. And Deinosuchus fossils are not rare where the thing was living. Here's some vertebrae from Texas. Here's some of the miscellaneous bones that we find from various places of Deinosuchus. This is kind of interesting. This is from the recent paper where they were creating 3 new species, or really recognizing 3 new species. One of the points it makes is that this is one of the vertebrae from Montana. It is huge. If this thing were complete on the right side, these are called diapophyses, it would be about 18 to 20 inches across. Want to hold your hands 18 inches apart. That's how big the vertebra would be of a huge animal. This is one from Texas, from the original specimen. This is one from Montana. which these authors are putting into a separate species. I don't really see much difference. And this is one from Alabama that I described. And obviously it's much smaller. In fact, most of our specimens from the east have been smaller than the ones from the west, but not all. There are a couple of teeth in the collections at CSU that are actually about as big as any of the ones from the western U.S. So I think we had some big eastern Deinosuchus, but I don't think they're very common, because most of the eastern ones are from smaller individuals. Smaller in this case is still not small. We're talking about crocodilians that range from about 25 to 30 feet long, and probably weighed 3,000 pounds. We're not talking about small animals. The very biggest Deinosuchus, the one called Hatcherai, if we had a skull with it, which we don't, probably would have been 40 feet long and would have probably weighed 7 to 8 tons. So we're talking about a very big creature. Now, one of the interesting things we find with these Deinosuchus fossils, we get what are called osteoderms. These are the plates of bone inserted into the skin on their backs. Here's an alligator to show you how it works. And I think it's, it looks like a crocodile actually when I look at the scutes. These are the osteoderms. And you might think they're there for protection or something, but they're not. Turns out where they live, these are usually the top predators, so they don't need to be protected. But these osteoderms actually help the animals walk. It turns out these osteoderms, the pits in these osteoderms, which are very distinctive in Deinosuchus, by the way, the pits in these have connective tissue which connected to muscles, and the muscles could contract across the back. So this animal could actually contract its back, pulling against these osteoderms, which would then help lift the belly off the ground and help it walk. So when they wanted to get off the ground when they were walking, they would contract their back, pull their back muscles together, and it would actually lift the lower part of the animal a little bit. So we think not only are these distinctive osteoderms from Deinosuchus, but to help us identify when we have a Deinosuchus fossil, but we also think that the presence of these heavy pitted osteoderms is evidence these creatures did walk around quite a bit. Some people have argued that they spent all their time in the water like most alligators do, but there's some evidence they got out and land pretty often too. Now, we haven't found any complete Deinosuchus, although we do have a lot of body parts from various animals. But here's a fairly good drawing of what it would look like, and it, looks kind of like your typical crocodilian. Except, as we show in this picture, it was probably lurking underwater most of the time under salt water, unlike alligators, say, which tend to live in freshwater. And I have to say that we put in a couple of fossil fish species in here for background. I will shamelessly say this is cover art for my book on the subject, which I published a number of years ago about Deinosuchus, which is, I guess, why I've been working on it. And as far as I know, this is about the most credible reconstruction of Deinosuchus in its life habit that we have so far. This skull is the most complete from the eastern part of the United States. It comes from Mississippi. It was designated as the type specimen, that is the namesake specimen of the eastern species, which I will, shamefully admit was named after me. It's not a very big animal for Deinosuchus. It's about 1.5 feet wide, the skull, and the length here is as preserved as about 24 inches long. So we put the skull into our reconstructions. It comes out to be about a meter-long skull, which for Deinosuchus is not a giant one, but then again, a meter-long skull for a crocodilian means you have an animal that's about 7 times as long as a skull, and probably even more than that. I think, actually, let me rephrase that. I think you take the skull and then figure the body is 7 times that length added, so we're probably looking at an 8-meter animal. That's about 25 feet, right? 26 for this animal. That would be a smaller Deinosuchus, but a typical one for the eastern United States. Now, using a photograph of that skull I took many years ago, that would be this part of it, I spliced on a specimen of a front area from a specimen from Alabama, which we collected quite a few years ago, and putting them together, carefully kind of balancing the two and sizing them together, comes out to look like this, which is not terrifically different from the western specimen in outline. Let me go back and flash on that. If we look at this reconstruction of a Texas specimen, you'll notice it's got a very long, parallel-sided tooth row, big inflated snout, and kind of a, tapering back end. And I don't think I can overlap the two of them in one image, but if you look at this, and then we look at my reconstruction of the eastern species, I think the general outline of the skull is pretty similar. Now, this one has been flattened a little bit, so you can't really judge by the width over here. Notice the premaxilla area is broken out here, so we don't really fully know what it was, but that suggests to me that it had those same big hollows that the Texas specimen showed too. Putting that on top of it again looks, to me they look pretty similar. Now we do have jaws. We've been looking at skulls, but we do get mandibles along with our skulls. This specimen here, which I'm sorry is a little fuzzy in my picture, came from the Chattahoochee River on the Georgia side. I collected that many years ago, and it would extend back to here if this part were complete, and to about here if it were complete on the front. And it's about a meter long jaw, about a 37, 38 inch long jaw. What's interesting about this specimen, it is the oldest Deinosuchus specimen we know of anywhere. This one dates to about 82 million years, and as far as we know, it's about 2 million years older than any other Deinosuchus we found. So it kind of gives us an old date for the eastern species. We also have comparable jaw material from the western U.S. This one's from New Mexico, which I just happen to have in the picture. Kind of interesting, we find a lot of lower jaw material in the east, not as much in the west, and I don't know if that's just coincidence or what, but we have fragments of quite a few lower jaws in the eastern United States. Well, leading up to the discussion of whether Deinosuchus was our top predator or what exactly it was doing, teeth of Deinosuchus reveal some very interesting stuff to us. This is a collection from my area and my collections in West Georgia, various types of teeth. We notice that the front teeth tend to be complete, not sharp, but not broken, whereas the back teeth almost always are fractured. I can't give you every percentage precisely, but I would say 80% of the rear teeth we collect from Deinosuchus in Georgia and Alabama have their tips broken off, and not just worn down, they're actually fractured. And this fracturing is, especially like this, is not from fossilization. This is actually wear during life. Now here's one that's complete. So there are some which are complete. They were rounded, but complete. And another thing we notice is that if we cut them down the middle, they're really thick, unusually so for crocodilians. Now the tooth structure of Deinosuchus is going to have some information for us about exactly what they did for a living. One of the questions to ask, was Deinosuchus a top predator, or was it a scavenger, or could it be both? Well, it turns out when we look at modern crocodilians, in this case both our species of crocodile, we can see both scavenging, like this Australian crocodile eating a really pretty rotted sea turtle, or this Nile crocodile, which is not a very sharp picture, but one of the rare pictures where they caught a crocodile attacking a lion. So using modern analogs, we have evidence of crocodilians being both scavengers and predators. So what was Deinosuchus? And the answer is, I would argue it was mostly a predator. And in the modern world, we definitely see modern saltwater crocodiles, like this Australian one, attacking sea turtles. We can feel sorry for the sea turtle, but this is nature. It's very common to see modern large crocodiles attacking large sea turtles. Well, it turns out with Deinosuchus we see the same behavior. When we look at the teeth, the worn down teeth, and as I said, we cut them in half and look at how thick they are, we can see these are teeth built for eating heavy bones and shells. And if we look at our fossils from Georgia especially, we find a lot of turtle shells with holes in them that are looked like they were punched by round teeth, as this cartoon suggests. Turns out also, when we look at these holes in the turtle shells, like this one here, they're about the size of a Deinosuchus tooth. In fact, this particular specimen, which comes from West Georgia, is really interesting. It's got about a 2.5 centimeter wide hole in it. You can't see from the picture, but it's about a centimeter deep. What's interesting, if I could take one of my worn down Deinosuchus teeth, they actually fit almost perfectly into that hole. Yeah, it's a little irregular, but if you're going to punch into a piece of hard bone like this turtle shell, you're going to make kind of an irregular hole. And interesting little fun fact, by the way, this hole is lined with new bone, which means this particular turtle survived the attack. Turns out we find lots of holes punched into turtle bones in Georgia. This one actually is from East Alabama, but we have them in Georgia too. And whatever made this round hole in this turtle shell was powerful enough to punch through about a half-inch of bone and break the bone on the inside. This would require a tremendous amount of bite force, and it turns out that the crocodilians have amongst the highest bite forces of living animals. I'm not an expert on bite force, but from what I have read in the literature, the most powerful bite force amongst animals nowadays are killer whales, followed by great white sharks, followed by crocodiles and alligators. And if you take a creature that would be an alligator and a half, you're looking at a bite force that would probably be greater than the great white shark, and getting up there, if not equaling, an orca, a killer whale. Powerful enough to crunch through heavy bones. So, when we look at who might be the competitor for being top predator on the East Coast, well, we have a dinosaur, a carnivorous dinosaur, in fact a tyrannosaur dinosaur. Not a giant tyrannosaur like T-Rex, but a decent-sized animal, maybe an 8-meter long tyrannosaur named Appalachiosaurus, which I've worked with too. In fact, I gave it the name. And these were living along the same place. Now, so the question would be, okay, was this the top predator, or was Deinosuchus? Well, can't prove for sure. We don't have exactly a smoking gun on this sort of thing, at least from Georgia. But we do have a sort of a smoking gun from further up in the Northeast. Turns out there's this famous bone amongst researchers in Deinosuchus, which is a ankle bone, or metatarsal, from a carnivorous dinosaur. We can tell by the bone texture and the shaft that it was definitely from a carnivorous dinosaur, and yet it is covered by these round, blunt chew marks. And the only thing living in these times and places that could have created this was the Deinosuchus. Deinosuchus is fairly common in the site where this came from too. When we look at the round, depressed chew marks, and this thing literally, I'm calling it a Deinosuchus chew toy. This thing was absolutely bitten over, chewed. There's no logical reason why a Deinosuchus would chew on a bone that many times unless it was in a predatory attack. So I think this bone makes a pretty good argument that where this thing was living, Deinosuchus was attacking it. Plus we have other specimens where we see similar kinds of round, depressed chew marks. Here's one in a turtle bone, and here's one, kind of a fuzzy picture, which I'll show you a better picture of it, in a dinosaur bone from Texas. Here's a better quality picture of that. This is a duck-billed dinosaur vertebra from the tail, covered by the same kind of dimpled chew marks in the place where the Texas Deinosuchus occurred. And I'm pretty sure this is evidence that Deinosuchus was killing and eating duck-billed dinosaurs in this place. So when we go back to all the evidences we have and look at a map of the United States, well, North America actually, we apparently had Dinosuchus Rio Grandensis along the coast on the western part of the seaway, Deinosuchus, namesake, on the eastern part of the seaway, and apparently when you were down close to the coast in these days, Deinosuchus was probably the top predator. And if you think about the kind of habitats where alligators and crocodiles live, when you're down by the seacoast and you're in a pretty wet environment, probably a crocodilian would have the advantage over a two-legged dinosaur. So I'll make the case that Deinosuchus was our top predator, certainly in our region here in Alabama, Georgia during that time, and as far as I can tell, probably up the seacoast as far as we have evidence, going up to about there is where our fossil sites are. And on the west side, Deinosuchus is known from Montana down through northern Mexico. So if you go back about 77, 76, up to about 80 million years ago, and took along the coast, we'd see probably a scene like this. I'm not sure about old blood and gore, or how many of these, whether they were hunting in packs, but we could have literally seen a giant crocodilian attacking a medium-sized carnivorous dinosaur, and almost certainly Deinosuchus would win the event. And I have to thank people who've helped me with my research over the years, including Jan Haney from Columbus State, who did some of the graphics, and Ron Herzel, one of our students, who did some of the drawings, and colleagues who've done work with me and funding for the National Geographic Society. So with that, thank you all.